Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a special edition of Making the Argument, where we are asking the question, what should the right want? We all seem to be fairly clear on at least one thing we're all fighting against. We're fighting against wokeness. And our guest today has probably done, I would argue, has done the best job of anybody of explaining the political and the philosophical underpinnings of wokeness, talking about how it's manifested in a place like communist China, how it's infiltrated in the United States. If you want to go down the rabbit hole of wokeness, James Lindsey is your guy. And I would highly encourage that you go take a look at the video he's put together over at New Discourses. His bullet points are fantastic. If you're looking for a crash course in wokeness, James has provided it for you free of charge. But today, we're going to talk more about this problem that we see within the right, because as it's been put before by one guest before, co-belligerents are not necessarily allies. And so if we can really have any hope of not just defeating wokeness, but then coming out the other end of this with something that we really believe in and want to fight for, we're going to be in trouble. Now, for the purpose of this conversation, we've identified kind of three groups on the right. One group is what you might kind of call the tech bros, or it's the people that are fairly new to the right, but they don't see any massive problems. They just kind of want to reset to 2005. That's where they want to start back over. And other than that, they're pretty happy with what's going on. Then you have this crowd that is still very, very much involved in the classical liberal tradition, but they're also very, very aware of some of the problems that we've seen transpire within our country. They understand some of the ways that wokeness infiltrated, and they want to preserve classical liberalism, but they do want to make some structural changes to make sure that we can be better for the fight. And then you have a third category. And this third category is at the point where they're kind of questioning everything. They don't want to reset to 2005. They might want to reset back to monarchy, which again is not in the American tradition, but they make an argument that, you didn't see wokeness of this variety springing up in the sort of environments that protected tradition. And they are trying to look for some sort of solution to this problem because, after all, as they argue, if the Constitution could have prevented this from happening, it would have. It didn't. So, what should we do going forward? So, James, looking at those three groups, is there any one group? I think I know the answer to this, but is there any one group that you would kind of more closely identify with?
Yeah, definitely. I'm in the group that just wants it to be 1995 specifically again. No, I'm just kidding. I'm the classical liberal group, pretty obviously. I think that the principles of classical liberalism work. I think that they are, in fact, universal truths. And since they're universal truths, they work for everybody. They work when they are applied, however, and they don't work when they've been abandoned. So my prescription would be that we have to get back to those roots and we have to apply our principles consistently and evenly, which includes equality before the law, which is one of the most broken ones that we have. Doing that, I also think is a hard project. It's a long project. It's not a 2-year project or a 3-year project. And so a lot of the difference that I think I have with a lot of people kind of in this discussion space is that I see this as a 25-year repair project, and they are freaking out that if we don't fix it in 2 or 3 years, like maybe while Trump is still in office, that all is lost. And so they see it as a insufficient circumstance that we've passed the point of no return. But I'm in that general classical liberal position. I don't know that I have a critique of classical liberalism writ large specifically, but I do think that there is fruitful ground for a discussion, which is how does classical liberalism, and I've given a very long podcast on this, by the way, so I've thought about it and talked about it. It's been a minute, but how does classical liberalism update to the 21st century technological frame that we find ourselves in, which I think is a very legitimate question. For example, just to give you a taste of what I mean, how do you secure somebody's right to private property when you have digital property and it becomes almost impossible to authenticate whose property is whose? Can you steal a meme is like a joke within that space.
Well, let me ask you this: like, if we to try to define our terms here, when I think of classical liberalism, I generally think of kind of more of a Lockean view of classical liberalism. So, I mean, Locke was obviously a very dedicated Christian. He actually went so far to say that atheism should be outlawed. But leaving that aside for a second, we would probably associate a Lockean version of classical liberalism with the ideas of individual liberty, private property rights, generally free markets. I mean, that doesn't mean no restrictions, but generally free markets. He would have also argued for representative government. He would have he obviously advocated for the strength and the importance of the family and cultural institutions and religious institutions, but he also would have looked at it from the standpoint of kind of like different provinces of responsibility. And I think when you look at the American founding, you see a lot of John Locke along with other things. Um, Now, some people will say, okay, Nick, that's one version of classical liberalism, but then you also have like the Jean-Jacques Rousseau version of classical liberalism that really goes. It's almost kind of this battle between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Um, how would you define that? That's kind of like how I see maybe the positive manifestations of classical liberalism within that Lockean tradition, built on a firm foundation of like you know, Christian morals and Christian culture. But I can't deny that Rousseau also comes from this tradition to some degree. So how would you define it?
I mean, I think Rousseau was in a gigantic argument and debate with the English and Scottish philosophers that outlined that Enlightenment, and I think he's a departure from it. I think it's very helpful to realize that these three guys, I'm going to name three, one being Locke, one being Rousseau, the other being Thomas Hobbes, were trying to work out. They were obsessed at the time, and I think this is generally a waste of time and a bad way to think philosophically, but it was like the fashion of the era to think about so-called state of nature. What is the human being if we stripped civilization away? And so you get generally three answers. Hobbes has this, we're a bunch of basically Mad Max savages, and if we, we're going to basically form a bunch of cartels, and we're just going to bully each other, endless war of all against all. And he says we solve that problem by generating a social contract through a powerful church state object he called Leviathan, that basically becomes something like a tyranny. We sacrifice many of our rights in order to have order and security and so on. And then Rousseau was kind of the exact opposite of this. He was like, the social contract is basically whatever people consent to. It's a manifestation of the general will, and that we're going to become more free by sacrificing our liberties, which actually doesn't make any sense. It's a dialectical notion. He had fanciful notions that he was taking, the writings of missionaries who were sending back, what's it like in Barbados or whatever, and then he'd read these things, which were just these kind of fairly poor descriptions of what was actually going on in native life with not a ton of understanding from an outsider, a French outsider looking in. And then he would transpose on that all his weird fantasies of basically a licentious, libertine lifestyle that he wanted to live. And he believed that we could be as free as the savages again, but we've got to keep, all the benefits of the city at the same time, and you actually get Marxism out of that. So I don't see this as a continuous stream within classical liberalism. And of course, third, you have Locke, and his state of nature is not a whole lot better in terms of being, they're a bit fanciful. He's got this idea that all these kind of autonomous individuals and sometimes groups or tribes end up working out through mutual consent the society that they want to have, but that's obviously not how things really work either. There were existing social structures. People do make contracts and can break bonds or whatever, but we don't live according to only a set of principles that we've totally consented to. Nobody consented to who their mother is, for example. And there are duties and obligations that you have to your parents for a wide variety of reasons, and you're just stuck with them. I mean, you can rebel against them, but I mean, there's a reason that that's one of the 10 commandments is not to do that. And so, they were, I just want to put that out there to say, first of all, here's these three distinct frames. Second of all, that they were coming at the question from a particular philosophical lens that's sort of like really, I know they weren't all the same era. Thomas Hobbes was like a century before Locke, and Locke was a bit before Rousseau. But this period of time had this kind of weird way of thinking about things, like let's get all the way down to like these weird brass tacks that actually are not indicative of reality, and then impose our vision of the world through it. So the three visions are, in my opinion, effectively Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and that means they're not the same thing. So I don't see the continental liberalism that Europe, that particularly France first and then Germany later picked up, as continuous with the Lockean and then Scottish common sense realist, which is a totally different tradition that came obviously from Scotland, that got imported to the Americas, and that Jefferson and Madison and all the rest were so invested in. This idea of common sense is not present in Rousseau, and it's not fully present in Locke. So there's this other idea that's so essential. So when you say, if you do want to boil it down to, you've kind of got the monarchists who are following the idea of Hobbes, and then you've got the the American Revolution that's doing this classical liberal thing, or as I've, just to be clear about this, I've started calling it classical American liberalism,
Mhm.
just to be very clear that I mean the thing that came through, this combination of Locke and common sense realism and Leviticus and Thomas Jefferson, who didn't believe in the miracles of the Bible, but was still very heavily rooted as a, use the bad word, cultural Christian, uh, even though he was a deist and didn't believe in the miracles and all this stuff, and the other founders. And then you've got this continental monstrosity of liberationism, ultimately, that comes out of the Romantic Rousseauian frame. And these are three distinct schools. And so if we confuse them, continental liberalism versus American liberalism, it's very hard to have this conversation. I don't think there's a lot of redeeming qualities in continental liberalism. In fact, I think it's largely mysticism posing as politics, and it's self-serving. Patrick Deneen, who would be in a very different camp than I am, says that, he says the liberal, but it's not the liberal mind. It's this continental thing or the leftist thing. He says that they have this concept of the self-defined self, that they're going to define themselves, and you can be whoever you are and whatever you want, and all of your um, relationships and all of your duties and obligations are totally of your own choosing, and so you're defining who you are and what your life will be. And that's, I mean, it's a straw man to the American liberal tradition because it doesn't fit. So the word liberal there is no good from Deneen. But the continental liberal tradition kind of does veer that way, and I think that's a disaster. So when I say, that I veer toward the classical liberal, I don't accept Rousseau. There's that old joke, you go back in time, you got two bullets, you got three people, what do you do? And you can pick any three people you want. It's like,
Become a dangerous thing in Virginia these days.
yeah, right. Well, the old joke was, it's like, I don't know, we got to pick three awful people, Hegel, Marx, and Rousseau, and the answer is that you go back and put both bullets in Rousseau to be sure. Um, and I kind of agree with that. So I do bend less toward Locke, though, in my view of classical liberalism and its foundations, and more toward people like Reid with the common sense tradition. Common sense meaning we all have sense making apparatuses and sense making processes in common. And therefore, we don't need no elite to tell us how the world works. We don't need somebody else to inform us how we're to understand the world around us. And at the end of the day, even with scriptural matters, we technically don't need some authority to tell us how to exegete the text. If we have the scripture before us and we take that as the authority, we don't need a priest or an intermediary or a bishop or anything else. Though they might be a helpful expert, we don't need one to be able to read the text and discern for ourselves what it means. So this common sense tradition is this, it's this redheaded stepchild, to mention Thomas Jefferson, backbone running through the American tradition that's not present on the continent. And when I said that there was this argument, it was specifically, and it was David Hume, who's not perfect either, but it's David Hume who Rousseau's rejecting at the time. And
Mhm.
so they had, I secretly kind of think it was a lover's spat. I'm just going to say that, but I don't know. I'm just speculating based on how badly Rousseau took the refutation. I'm not onboarding everything Hume said. I don't think that Hume was fully invested in this common sense thing. I don't think he had everything right. But
Yeah.
what I do know is that Rousseau, for some reason, got very mad at what Hume was saying and was doing this kind of like defiant rejection of it. And I just think he messed up the continent, and it's not representative of what I think is useful going forward. That common sense element has to be there at the foundation.
No, I find myself when I'm talking with somebody that's traditionalist or neo-reactionary or whatever else, they want to categorize as, and I'm looking at their critiques of classical liberalism, my response is usually, look, I'm fine with understanding critiques of any man-made system. My problem though is that when I look at Rousseau, that seems like such a massive departure. And you said something in there that I think it's important when you talk about the continental system, this liberation concept. It's almost as if they're trying to liberate themselves from reality.
They are.
And anything which is perceived as some sort of restriction on their reaching self-actualization or whatever else is, like that's the very definition of evil. It is standing in the way of the way they view themselves and they want to be. It's one of the reasons why you'll look at some of the critiques that you get from that kind of school of thought, and they will assign to, like, capitalism, for instance. They will assign to capitalism a sin which is just a process of existence. So, like, I can't believe I have to work for my food. Yeah, that's existence. It's not capitalism. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I had a total rant about this, not to divert you, just the other day. It was funny because this I was at this thing in Michigan, and this poor lady just overhears me go off on this. I was in a restaurant actually in Michigan with a guy, and so I don't know who's around me, and I just go off on this tear where it's like I had just seen it on my social media where some leftist, some communist was complaining, exactly what you just said. Basically, capitalism is, where you have to work for your food and poverty doesn't exist in nature. And I'm like, what the heck are they talking about? Poverty is literally the default state of nature. Have you
Yeah.
watched, I don't know, any animal anywhere ever? Like their whole life is scrabbling for food and to not get eaten all the time. Like
Mhm.
base poverty is in fact the thing that we've all worked to build civilization not to be in. And so, yeah, there is this desire to liberate from reality there, to liberate from any sense of restriction of what they can imagine for the parameters of their lives. So it's an imagination driven or an idealism driven picture. And just because, it's my expertise in critical theory, I've kind of recently come to understand that this is what's going on with critical theory is that they don't actually know what that perfect world looks like. They just know what parts where they feel oppressed, like reality is oppressing me. And so they don't know what they want. They just know what they don't want. And so what you get out of that situation, which I call negative idealism, they know there's an ideal or they believe there's an ideal state of society, but we don't have it. And we know we don't have it because, say, there's racism. So
Mhm.
what they then do is go on this like puritanical witch hunt against racism. And since things don't magically get perfect, as maybe they do correct some racism, I don't know. Um, we have a civil rights movement or something, and everything's a little bit better. And it doesn't all get better. They go on the witch hunt turns into this purity spiral, and then what you end up with is critical race theory and basically racial Marxism. It's like a downward spiral because their belief is that a qualitatively different world will exist when they purge the existing world of the great sin that is the thing that's not supposed to be in their ideal. And so that's again with Rousseau, this focus on imagination, kind of as the basis for how you're going to see the future parameters of society. And this is again why it's at odds with this common sense. Common sense is definitely, I mean, it sounds like it has its feet on the ground, but the idea actually is that the reason that we can have unity of belief in a common sense tradition is because we all have the sense apparatuses necessary to check the answers that somebody gave. So if I come in and I measure your living room and I tell you it's 27 feet across and you're like, I don't think it's that big. And I'm like, well, I measured it. You're like, give me the tape measure. Actually, I don't trust yours. Let me get mine. Right. And we can actually defer to some objective standard outside of ourselves to make sense. And where it's confusing, then we have a debate and we try to apply reason and other tools, sometimes rhetoric and whatever. But in the thing that we got going on over in the continent, where it's imagination and idealist based, um, where reality becomes the enemy, the problem there is that there is no standard to appeal to except the imagination of the guy who's in charge and his gang of thugs that he puts around himself. So you end up with an arbitrary standard. You end up with this, you know, totalitarian vision ultimately, because you have two options ultimately for how you can get massive political unity, which these guys believe you have to have a functioning polity. And one of those answers is that we appeal to the most objective standards that we can find, and that's the common sense, rule of law, classical liberal, and the American sense tradition. And the other one is Well, if we've got to have consensus, we're just going to manufacture it and force it on people. And that's where you start getting Jacobins and Marxists and Bolsheviks and fascists who are trying to force a manufactured consensus about reality and the limitations, the lack of limitations of human potential, really, that come with their imaginative vision. So again, a huge diversion, and that common sense thing being the key element for me that's got to be there. That, and common sense doesn't mean, oh yeah, it's common sense, don't put your hand on the stove. It means that which anyone with the proper approach, which is not some special magical ritual, it's just observation, reason, do the math or whatever it works out to, is able to discern or determine for themselves independently of what other people do. Therefore, we have sense making in common with one another.
I want to thank True Classic because they are one of our sponsors for this podcast. Now, as you know, we love True Classic around here. I am currently wearing one of my favorite black True Classic T-shirts, and my wife was the one that introduced True Classic to me because she was tired of me wearing a bunch of ill-fitting stuff because, quite frankly, I didn't care. But guys, you should care. You should care how you look for your lady, for your wife, right? And True Classic has got you covered. And it's not just T-shirts. It's active wear. You like to go to the gym? I'm telling you, you're going to love True Classics because they fit right. So when you're getting your pump on, like you can actually see it feels good in the shirt. Try out their fitness gear. I absolutely love it. Their shorts are awesome. Also, they've got the formal stuff too, right? You need the button downs, right? You need the button down with the T-shirts, maybe something a little bit more summer casual. We're moving into the winter months now. You're going to need more long sleeve. They have got some great Henleys, which is something that Tina loves it when I wear. So I'm telling you, go over to trueclassic.com right now, and you're going to use trueclassic.com/Nick because you're going to let them know we sent you, right? And that is good for you. It's good for True Classic. It's good for us. It's a great way to support the show. But if you are out and about and you have forgotten to use the link that we provide in the description to go buy your True Classic, not to worry because you can now find them out and about at the stores, Target, Costco, etc. Go get your True Classic. Again, it has become the vast majority of what I wear now because it is comfortable, because it is durable, and because it just fits the way it should. Trueclassic.com/Nick. Go try them out. So let me ask on this because one of the critiques that is coming from, part of the coalition against wokeness, for lack of a better term, is that, okay, that's all great. We share your belief in common sense. Now, the one thing that will get brought up, and that I think is a fair critique, is that, okay, but common sense can tell us a lot of things about what we should do with respect to, let's say, ordering our lives to achieve better security or prosperity or comfort. But it can't ultimately tell us, like, morally right or wrong, what you ought to do. It can say that if you do these things, that it yield these results. And then it's that quest for the transcendent. Like, if there is objective truth, if there is objective morality, well, then it would suggest that there's an objective, like, moral lawgiver, right? And that's where you get into the question of God. And to your point, you had someone like Jefferson that would definitely fall more into the deist camp. But then most of the other, signers of the Declaration of Independence, for instance, were definitely more like what you would call solid Christians. They were solid in Christian doctrine.
Sure.
So part of the argument there is like, okay, this classical liberalism, this idea of common sense, this idea of being able to use things like the laws of logic, to be able to use things like the scientific method in order to come to, reasonable and rational conclusions about how our environment exists and how natural processes exist. All of that's great, but it has to be built upon something. It doesn't sustain itself in and of itself. How would you respond to that sort of statement?
Well, I mean, I think it is possible to discern some moral truth just through interaction and experience. So there is this capacity for common sense to apply, at least to a degree. Like, it doesn't take a whole lot of figuring out that, if if I hurt somebody, it's probably pretty similar to if they hurt me. So the golden rule, as it's given in the Bible, for example, both in Leviticus and from the gospel, is not that, like, it's, a lot of people treat it as a much more profound observation than it is, but it doesn't come pulled out of, the universe. It's actually discernible. But at the same time, Classical liberalism often gets strawmanned as kind of secularizing the world to the point where it eliminates this ability for, say, a scriptural authority. And as you said, all but a handful, a small number of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, of the framers of the Constitution, had at least a, pretty, solid Christian belief or cultural. I mean, like I said, Jefferson didn't believe in the miracles and was a deist, but he was certainly a cultural Christian in the vast majority of the ways. I know that a lot of Christians get upset about that term cultural Christian, but we're going to have to recognize that it's a thing to live by those same ethics and have been raised in those same ethics and so on. But you have to ask yourself at that point, well, okay, so let's say we have 50 of these guys thereabouts, and they're going to sit down to frame this country, and then the First Amendment that they put in, literally number one, is like, okay, so nothing's going to impinge upon belief. We're going to put, in fact, two clauses in the First Amendment to prevent, the free exercise clause and the establishment clause, to prevent the state from mucking around in religion. Now, a lot of people would argue, well, they left that to the states, but by 1831, pretty much every state had decided, holy crap, this isn't working. This isn't a good idea. So why would such strong Christian men framing the country decide that religious liberty was so important? And the answer is because they didn't trust man to be the ultimate authority on how the scripture is going to be read. They believed that different factions, which we might call denominations, can read the scripture for themselves and have the debates in a civil manner, unlike the religious wars that they were rejecting and fleeing from, and outright religious oppression. In some cases, Calvinists in particular were pretty heavily oppressed, that they were fleeing from in Europe, which is where you had these monarchical episcopates. You now have the state and the church wedded together. And what was happening was people were reading the scripture for themselves and saying, I don't think it says that. Like, this isn't my reading of the scripture, right or wrong. I mean, Luther famously said it this way, here I stand, so help me God, for I can do no other. And the same mentality extends to a lot of these other Protestants later. And so they come to America, and the idea was like, are we going to impose, Thomas Jefferson's wacky razor knife Jefferson Bible? Are we going to impose John Adams' universalist, congregationalist denying of the Trinity? Are we going to impose, whoever? It doesn't matter. We could pick whichever ones we want. Patrick Henry's. Whose Christianity are we going to do? And the answer that are we going to take George Washington's, which seemed to be pretty solid, and certainly he was an extremely devout man. Whose are we going to pick? And the answer seemed to be like, no, no, no. We left that behind. It's more important for people to be able to pursue the scripture for themselves, to try to determine as accurately as they can what it means, and to be given the liberty, at least from the state, to do that. And so what they were relying on is actually the same common sense. So if we take that the scripture is a moral authority, which is nowhere prohibited in anything in the classical liberal framework. So if we take that the scripture is in fact a moral authority, that it is a source book, a guidebook by which we can discern moral truths and even absolute moral truths, then the matter of the question becomes, well, how do we figure out what they are? And the answer that the framers gave was, well, the state has no authority to tell somebody they're reading scripture wrong. That's a matter left to a different sphere of life. The state is going to stay out of that because we're going to protect people's ability to do that, because the state back in Europe would have maybe cut your head off or some awful torture or burned you at the stake, like Latimer and Ridley were burned at the stake in Oxford. I mentioned them because I've been on the, I've stood on the spot where it happened. And they didn't want any of that. They wanted people to be able to appeal to the common sense of their ability to read the scripture and apply exegetical methodologies according to the various confessions of belief that they had, and to allow the debate in a safe and not murderous method to go back and forth, to where if a Methodist wants to challenge a Presbyterian, they may in a debate hall or in, everyday debates here and there. It is true, like I said, they set up state churches, not all of the different states. I'm in Tennessee, which wasn't one of the original 13, but it came along in 1796, so not much later. And I don't know which number it is. I should look that up. But at any rate, Tennessee, in its state constitution, it explicitly prohibits the idea of any state church, because anything that would be the state imposing a matter of conscience is prohibited in our Article 1, Section 2 or something. It's right at the beginning, 3 maybe. think it's Article 1, Section 3 of our state constitution. So some states didn't, but a lot of them did. And what they ran into were problem after problem after problem of religious liberty issues coming up, where it was in opposition to the idea of the liberty-minded, you know, primary ethos that they had for establishing the country in the first place. So that by the time the Civil War rolls around, very few states still have this on the books at all, and very few states are practicing it. So the answer seems to be, you know, first of all, we can answer some moral questions through regular common sense. General revelation of moral truth is still possible. But then if we have to appeal to special revelation, literally nothing's stopping anybody. Nothing's actually stopping people from imposing it on their own sect if they want to, as a matter of fact, as a matter of church discipline or whatever else. But what is actually prohibited is that the state is going to step in and tell you that you have to believe this way or that way, and your reading of the scripture is therefore right or wrong, and your denomination is therefore approved or unapproved. I mean, my question for the people that want it to go the other way is, which three-letter agency do you want to handle determining whether or not your church should exist?
Yeah. Well, and my question on this is, I guess it's a little bit more broad. So when, like for instance, when Adams, like you said, Adams was not he didn't believe in the Trinity. When Adams says that our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people and is totally unsuited to the government, of any other, there seems to be an implication that seems to at least be broadly shared with most of the founders. Thomas Paine would probably be an exception to that rule, but even Benjamin Franklin, who is probably the least religious, next to Paine, really cautioned against that. And you see the same thing in Washington with his farewell address. This idea that that the transcendent, um, was something of a necessary component in being able to prop up this notions of what you might call ordered liberty, speaking of another term that is fallen out of favor in certain circles. But this idea that we want liberty to be ordered in such a way to where, you are generally free to live your life the way you want, believe what you want, worship the way you want, provided that you don't infringe on the rights of others to do the same. I think the question comes down, and I've gotten this before as I'm a state legislator in Virginia. Like we're very, very proud of Jefferson's, Statute of Religious Liberty. Um, but it's this idea of when somebody says, "Well, Nick, you can't legislate morality." I always remind them that it's the only thing you can legislate. That literally every single law harkens back to some sort of moral premise, and I don't think it's inappropriate for me to use my Christianity as a source of morality that I can refer to when determining, you know, legislation on murder or what the punishment should be, or things of that nature. By the same token, I am not permitted to use the power of the state to compel you to believe in Christianity. That would be heretical, to the Christian my faith, in my opinion.
Yeah, I
And
agree with
so
you, by the way.
yeah, so where do you see as kind of the balance between this idea of, um, appreciating the necessity of the transcendent, and hopefully we want that to be, true, while at the same time allowing for religious liberty?
Well, the idea of the religious liberty is that the approach to the transcendent is the thing that the state's not going to mess around with. But as far as any of these practical matters of morality, murder, theft, and so on, it is because these things are true. Like, I kind of see it the other way around. Of course, being that I'm not religious, I look at the scripture a very different way. And a lot of people don't. They're like, "Oh, James hates, God or something," and it's like that's not true. I don't reject the scripture. I just don't know if it's literally true. I'm one of those pesky, annoying agnostics. Okay, so I believe, in fact, that the Bible is at least anthropologically true. And I want to draw attention. I'm not going to elaborate, but on every one of the words I just said, at least, which means it might be more, anthropologically true, which means it is true for human beings in individual and societal circumstances, which means it is an excellent guide for that. I would very much want legislators like you using your Christian faith to, inform how you're going to uh, legislate, how you're going to deal with the issues of the day. Because if it's anthropologically true, it's true for human beings. But if it's anthropologically true, it's true for human beings, not merely because it was dictated, but because it's actually true about something to do with humans. So my weird view is not, in fact, that God gave us a bunch of arbitrary laws. He gave us laws that match our nature. which means that we can appeal to the realities of human nature in crafting our laws. And if the scripture becomes the reason that you look there, and then you have to dig one layer deeper than God said it, I believe it, that finishes it, then I think not only is it great that scripture pointed you there, but that it's going to be much firmer for clarifying your understanding, your application, and so on. And it avoids the imposition. If you can get that one layer deeper, okay, God said that this is the law, but the law accords to human nature because that's the law God would give us as it is for human nature. So, what is it in human nature that this law is addressing? And I don't believe any of it's arbitrary. Unlike a lot of these other kind of mystical traditions, I actually think that the law that we find in whether it's Leviticus, which 75% of the American legal system is based off of, the Hebrew Bible at least is what they actually said. Leviticus has a lot of it,
Mhm.
whether it's even in New Testament stuff, whatever, a lot of that stuff is there because it actually speaks truths about human nature. It's a guidance on how to organize a life and a society such that it will be functional. So that allows a legislator to use the sincerity or the depth or the absolute fidelity of their Christian faith to inform their legislation, and encourages them to take that one step deeper and to say, why is this law part of, why would God have given us this law in the first place? Well, certainly it must accord to something in human nature. What would it be? Oh, well, humans like to get stuff for free. Therefore, we shouldn't allow stealing. Why? Because when we start stealing, what we do is we could go into the whole details
Yeah.
of why people shouldn't steal. We could even do it like, like aliens came down and looked and said, well, these societies that rip each other off get pretty dysfunctional pretty quickly. You steal something from me, I figure out you stole it from me. The next thing you know, I'm outside your house with a pipe, ready to beat you on the head when you come out the door and get my thing back. Things get dysfunctional really fast. And so you can actually get down underneath this and say, well, what's the human nature? The human nature is people want stuff for free. People want to be free riders. Not all people, but
Mhm.
some, and it might only be 2 or 3%, but they cause massive problems. So let's go ahead and legislate against that, and then you can do it without imposing, God said it, that's why we're gonna do it.
And I think it's interesting when I'll even look even when you look at something, this idea of people want things for free, you could say that, okay, this is the notion that people want to attain wealth or property or whatever it is with the least amount of effort possible.
Mhm.
Well, that's not necessarily in and of itself bad, provided that you're not harming someone else in the process. If you can find a more efficient or better way to do something, that's great.
Right,
But
it's
like you
actually
said,
very good,
yeah,
unless
but
you're
like you said,
robbing somebody.
the incentive structure and the consequences matter when looking at all those factors.
That's exactly right, and that is actually the basis of wealth and abundance, is that we are trying to figure out how to solve our own problems as quickly, effectively, efficiently, economically, and so on as we possibly can, even with innovative ways. And all abundance comes from this. Once you add in the securing of private property to what I just said, this is where wealth comes from. Period. Because now I have the ability to secure my private property, set the terms of my exchange, and if I solve a problem for myself, or if you're my neighbor and I solve a problem for you and I think, man, this could help a lot of other people. A lot of people have this problem with the type of pipe they have in their bathroom or whatever it is. And I come up with some, quick solution to it. And I figure out how to make that thing and sell it. Now I can make a profit off. If it costs me $100 to make the thing, I sell it for 120. I take $20 home every time. But if I can figure out how to keep selling it at 120, but make it for 80, by innovating, by blah, 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 it's more efficient, it's more economical. You start getting people willingly building surpluses for strangers to solve problems that strangers have without ever having to know them or care about them. Like, I don't need to know you to sell you a pipe for your bathroom. And so you get everything out of this. So, wanting to get things with the smallest number of resources expended as possible is a good impulse. But like you said, it all comes down to legislation having to set the incentive structures so that we get a positive sum game played in society out of this situation, which means property rights, etc., rather than a negative sum game, which is, well, you have it, I want it, you weren't there, so I took it, which is going to end up costing everybody all over the place.
Everything we're talking about right now, when we talk about, and again, I like the fact that you kind of zeroed in a little bit more on not just using this kind of broad term of classical liberalism, which might be over to a little bit more interpretation, but zeroed in on kind of like this American tradition within it and what that represents and how that's distinct from what we might call the continental tradition. or even aspects of maybe the English tradition. And incorporating these aspects of the transcendent and the idea of objective truth and objective morality. So, and then it's just a question of, okay, how do we it, but there was something else you said. I don't want to misquote you. I want to make sure I get it correctly. You were talking about how there's certain aspects of that classical tradition that you see as being universals. And that's where, again, some people would push back on that and say, okay, well, they may be universals to us. And as long as Nick Freitas and James Lindsey are the ones setting the rules for Nick Freitas and James Lindsey, this is all fine, even though we would disagree on certain things. But what they would also say is that when we look at what is going on in the United States right now, when we look at what's going on in the UK right now and Europe right now, what we see is this mass importation of people that it turns out they don't share any of those values. And somebody that as somebody that fought in Iraq, where all of a sudden we were gonna overturn Saddam Hussein and bring them the benefits of classical liberal thought and representative government and all these wonderful things that we valued in the West. And of course they were going to adopt it because all they had to do was see the genius of how it all worked. And turns out, yeah, it didn't work that way. And so the part of the question here is we now have people that they're starting to question what they see as some of the presuppositions within classical liberalism. And they're saying, no, we need to understand that the reason why this works in the West is because it's a creation of the West. And it actually came from the way that our own traditions were produced organically over centuries. And that's why it works for us. And it would be absurd to plop this down in the Middle East where there is no such tradition and expect it to work. And likewise, it would be ridiculous to import a bunch of people from a place that have never had this tradition and expect them to be able to successfully integrate. And so that's why what we need to be is we need to be more protective. We need to understand that this isn't so much universal as it is just a Western tradition. Would you have any pushback against that?
Yeah, a huge amount, because I actually think the principles underneath are universal, but it doesn't mean that every culture has decided to adopt them. I don't believe cultures are equal. I believe that the more you adhere to universal principles of effectively what boils down to, it's going to sound a little weird, but the three legs of the stool, as far as I see it, are truth, justice, and love. And I mean love in the kind of literally Christian biblical sense. That if you adhere to those three principles, that your society flourishes. Truth is whether or not you're getting right answers to questions. You're finding out actually accurate facts about reality. To the degree that you deviate from that is the degree that eventually reality punishes you for your deviation. So you're going to start losing out. Whoever, if you have two people that are running businesses and they're competitors, it doesn't matter the scale or scope of the business. If one of them is adhering to or discovering valuable truth more efficiently and more accurately than the other, they will outcompete the other, all else being equal. Justice is what we were just talking about. This idea that we don't get to just take from one another. This is unfair. In other words, the concept of equity, which by the way doesn't mean what the left says it means. The concept of equity does not mean what the Russians called actual equality. The Soviets, I should say, not the Russians. The Soviet program of actual equality is the thing we call equity. If you wonder why it seems like it sucks like Soviet Union, it's because it's literally a Soviet Union import that's been foisted upon us by communists. But equity means getting what you deserve and not getting what you don't deserve. That's what it means. But that's also what justice means. So equity and justice are two sides of the same coin. Equity is just your actual return on a just system. And a just system is one where people get some close approximation to what they deserve, and they do not get what they do not deserve, leaving out the fortunes of chance, which are kind of beyond any. If a meteor hits your house, nobody deserves a meteor to hit your house, but you can't do anything about it. It just happens. And so if you don't have a unjust society, I think this is going to start tearing things apart over time. So the degree of injustice, the degree of graft, the degree of bribery that makes your system work, which I'm sure you saw a lot of in Iraq, this kind of thing, which we're all dealing with now that, import the third world, become the third world, is sort of true. If you bring in too many people too quickly, they won't assimilate. If you try to plop down a system that they don't recognize, that goes against their traditional long-standing ways of life and how they've adapted to participate in those, they're not going to change overnight. They're not going to get it overnight. But and then love, of course, is, I just want to put that out there as the third leg, which is, do we generally want a pro-social situation, or do we operate in a low trust inimical situation? It's love versus enmity. And I think that the reason, this one of the secret sauces of the West, is not only do we use this common sense approach to get very close to truth and to compete in our free market economies with truth as the kind of arbiter, including the truths of what people want, not always what they need, right? Life would be awful if all we had was our base needs being met, and then we all get to live in, gray slop. That's the porridge in the Matrix nobody wants. The guy goes back in for the steak. And if we have a just society, a truth-based society, these are the secrets there, because we've done, like, if you look at our Constitution with the presumption of innocence, no cruel and unusual punishment, and so on, we have a lot of justice built in. A lot of that came from, like I said, the Hebrew Bible. 75% is what the rough estimate that I've seen is in some papers I've read. But if we approach these truth and justice things in a frame of, we want generally for our neighbors to succeed, although we don't necessarily care about them, we want them to succeed in the abstract, versus, some kind of inimical, he gets his, I get mine, and we're at loggerheads, and it's kind of brutal competition. Then if we're in the we want our neighbors to succeed situation, then we're in this positive sum situation. And this is why I think that the West has a long tradition that is rooted in Christianity and Judaism both, that have come up with this secret sauce that's made America so successful. So it's a little bit like blaming metal for rust. It's like it's not quite, but like the fact is, these universal truths are there, but not everybody takes them. And I agree. I know that this is a Sam Harris thing with his moral landscape, but I agree that we could actually, in some sense, measure the outcomes. I don't think the Gini index or any of these stupid indices they've come up with have worked, but we can at least intuitively perceive that some societies are doing a lot better than others in very material and even immaterial ways. But the material ones matter, because you can have a very tightly knit society where there's this hierarchy and everything seems very generationally knit, and people report having high degrees of happiness and family cohesion, etc. And this is one of the big arguments, and their GDP is absolute crap. Well, everything's great until, a hurricane shows up. If your GDP is crap, your per capita, your hurricane is going to kill a lot of people, and it's going to cause a lot of suffering and misery. If your GDP per capita is high, what you're going to be able to do, just think of it like, imagine something bad happened to two people in your neighborhood. One of them has a lot of money and can go hire people to fix the problem, and one of them doesn't have as much money and cannot hire anybody, right? And so having the outcome of GDP per capita being high is a sort of proof of concept that you're doing something right, not everything right, but doing something right in your society. It's not a be all that ends all. This is a very multidimensional, complicated situation. So when you say, okay, let's look at these real situations you asked. You offered two situations, and they're effectively the same situation in two different domains. One is, we're going to go over to Iraq, bomb the shit out of them, and now we're going to tell them, look how good classical liberalism is, which is what built us all of our bombs, and don't you all want to live this way because we said in the Declaration of Independence that we see these truths as self-evident. And they aren't ready to see the truths as self-evident because they've got a lot of other blinders in the way, including the bombs we dropped on them. It's not going to work, right? There is a correct argument from the kind of Burkean traditionalist perspective, not to be confused with the perennialist traditionalist perspective of Julius Evola. This Burkean tradition model is, there is this thing where people have to come to understand, and there's a society is a slow moving object. There is a lot of time, a lot of experience where people have to learn lessons generationally, where the old timers don't give up their ways, and the graft in the system is so easy to come back in because that's just how it's always been done. It's going to be a slow process, and it's actually better, just kind of like with Christianity. It works because I think it's a truth, is that you're going to do it mostly by a more of a Great Commission program rather than a colonialist program. You're going to come in and you're going to say, look, this stuff works. If you want help doing it, we got you. And if you don't, enjoy fighting with sticks in the desert. And then on the other hand, if you import more people, and this is, I think, the crucial argument here that's happening, because there's a dirty, ugly little slip here. Okay, so you say, okay, well, let's bring all these people from the desert or wherever else. We plop them down a million at a time in the US or Canada or whatever, or the UK or Germany. And now there's stabbings everywhere and everything's, they're out running around in the streets. People are, grabbing cats or whatever and frying them up. Actually, it's not cat. I just saw a video. It wasn't like a pet, but, they were catching salmon in a river. So it's wild animal, but they're catching salmon that are doing a run in Canada, which is illegal because of the populations of that particular salmon or whatever, and they're just catching them out of the river. And obviously, you get all these problems. That's the point. And this question of assimilation rates is real. But the slip in the argument is that you start going into an essentialism, that there's something fundamentally wrong with the people who come from the desert,
Yep.
that their culture and their ethnicity and their race are actually somehow tied together in some fundamental way, which I frankly see very little evidence for. There may be issues of race and IQ and whatever else that have some statistical realization, but the fact is that I've met people who were born in America, who were raised American, often in adopted situations. So they were raised from being a baby, a lot of them from China, a lot of them from other countries, including in the Middle East, who were raised 100% in stereotypical pro-America, white Christian homes. And guess what? They're Americans,
Yeah.
right? So it has nothing to do with their genetics. It has, like, they didn't magically import these bad ways of thinking or backwards ways of thinking, or even just, less clear ways of thinking from their parents who they maybe never met. And so when we slip in that argument, you lose something. But no, you cannot you can't incorporate an entirely new culture in huge numbers. We saw the same problem happening in the U.S. Uh, a century and a half ago when we were importing enormous numbers of Germans and enormous numbers of Irish all at the same time for similar but not as you know messed up on the government end reasons. There were wars, there were famines where they were. They came over in huge numbers for the opportunity of a better life. And it turns out that they ended up making lots of pockets that assimilated very, very, very slowly.
Yeah.
And this carries over. I mean, it's got some of its charms, but this is a big problem when you have other countries or other cultures that are actually not just different to the broader American culture, but inimical to it. And
Well, and that's this is interesting because I remember it was I was finishing up my college degree after I got out of the military, and I was actually at Northern Virginia Community College for this English class I needed, this English credit I needed. And all of a sudden, in the English class, what are we doing? We're reading Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. We're reading deconstructionism and Derrida, and I'm like, yeah, nothing screams English literature like this stuff. But I'll never forget. We're watching this one thing, and the professor, white liberal professor, keeps saying black culture, black culture, black culture. And Northern Virginia Community College used to have the distinction of having the most diverse student body in the country. And I'm probably 31 at this point. I raise my hand. I'm like, what are you talking about? When you say black culture, you keep saying black culture. What are you talking about? And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, first of all, what do you mean when you say culture? And he looks back at me and goes, what do you mean? I said, well, okay, for lack of a better definition, I'll use Bell's definition of culture as society's attempt to come up with a coherent set of answers to the existential questions we face throughout our lives. Right? I don't even think that's the best one, but that's the one I had at the time.
Mhm.
And he goes, okay, we can use that. He goes, what's your question? Are you telling me that if I talk to a black person in Los Angeles, Mobile, Alabama, Paris, France, and Moscow, Russia, I'm going to get the exact same answer because of their melanin levels? And all of a sudden he gets kind of nervous because he understands the implications if he says yes. Because what he's then saying is that culture is essentially determinist based off of your race. And the argument I was making is that yes, you can have a group of people that might all be treated a particular way because of their race, develop cultural institutions or responses to questions. I said, but that's because of the conditions that they found themselves in a particular place of time and geography. To just say that race determines culture, I think is a very racist way to look at culture. And so, and the other thing that I have a problem with that is that I feel like they were doing that intentionally so they could say, if I have any problem with your cultural traditions, I must be a racist. When it's like, no, I don't like your political tradition. I don't think your political tradition merges well with our political tradition. And therefore, if you take a lot of people of a particular political tradition, which is contradictory or diametrically opposed, well, then of course you're going to have, you're not going to have social cohesion.
Right.
And and then, but this comes to the other question, right? And this kind of goes into this: what are we fighting for? So if we've looked at this kind of American version of the classical liberal tradition, and we agree that things like representative government and certain limitations on government power and private property rights, like all of these things are positive things that we believe are not only true for us, but they tend to be universally true, which is to say that they produce the best results provided that people voluntarily accept them, adopt them, and apply them. I mean, obviously, we have lived in a country that was theoretically built upon these principles, and yet there has been this infiltration. And we can look at, you've done a great job of looking at, Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse and, Jean-Paul Sartre and the postmodernists and everything that is. What do you say to the response that, well, great. It's wonderful that we had all these great ideas, James, and we had a constitution that was supposed to establish this and protect this and do all these things. And yet here we find ourselves in 2025, where almost every single significant culturally shaping institution is dominated by leftist ideology, by specifically maybe woke ideology. When I look at arts and entertainment, when I look at Hollywood, I see woke. When I see academia, I see woke. When I see my public school system, I see woke. When I see the bureaucracy with them, I see woke. Right? So how would this, if all these ideas were so good, how come they didn't protect us from this?
Yeah, that's a interesting argument. Of course, Lysander Spooner put that one. I get the Spoonerism all the time,
Yeah.
basically that if the Constitution either enabled this or was unable to present it. So in either case, it's worthless. And I'll just point out just kind of a couple of things very quickly. One is, your body has an immune system and it's designed in some sense, therefore, not to get sick, but it still somehow manages to get sick about once a year, once every year and a half or so for most people, maybe 2 or 3 times a year if you travel a lot or whatever. And it's like, the saying often is the purpose of a system is what it does. The body gets sick. The immune system flubs. Does that mean that the immune system should just be ejected? Should we just get rid of it and try to make a new immune system? Um, and so, the thing is there are the metaphor is that there are invading foreign pathogens and they do wish to infect societies. Communism is one such. Islamism or radical Islam is another. It deliberately and explicitly has the intention of colonizing and conquering other other systems. So, not to praise the book too much because I don't love the book, but in The Virtue of Nationalism, Yoram Hazony writes about kind of the Jewish model of nations, which is nationalism, and then the not Jewish model of nations, which is basically imperialism. And he kind of contrasts. Of course, there's a spectrum, but you don't have to be totally an imperialist nation like Nazi Germany, and you don't have to be totally a nationalist entity in the way that he means it, which would be Israel, at least traditionally or historically. There's a lot of places you could be between, but basically this idea is that there are imperialist ideologies and imperialist militant imperialist ideologies that are actively trying to figure out how to crack the code on other institutions, including other countries or civilizations, and get inside them. And so let's take, for example, Catholicism. That's an institution that's famous for its ability to have withstood communism. In fact, the Soviets were insanely mad about the Catholics. They put a lot of effort. They had no trouble conquering Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, I really should say, because Russian Orthodox was in Russia, which they controlled. So they were able to use tons of evil state power to just basically cow the church. Most of the religious dissidents in Soviet Union were not Russian Orthodox because they had this so-called registered church and so on. But Catholicism was this outside force. You have popes writing missives against communism. I think it's true. I don't know. I've said this before. I'm pretty sure it's true that while Karl Marx was in Paris in 1844, he's in this apartment there near the Sorbonne and he's writing the Paris manuscripts, the so-called economic philosophic manuscripts, and out the window, some distance away, I don't know if it's a direct line of sight, you have whichever pope. I want to say it's not Leo the 13th. I want to say it's Pius 12th, but I'm not positive of which one it is. Writing this famous 1843, 1844, this famous attack on the idea of communism, which the Communist Manifesto hasn't even been written yet. It's 4 years out, and this Pope is like bombarding this idea of communism as awful and terrible and against Catholic thinking. And allegedly, they were in a stone's throw apart, writing these two things at the same time. So it may be within a direct line of sight of one another. But the point is that the Catholic Church has put up a fight against communism historically that is really admirable and lasted a very long time and was some of the strongest resistance to it in the 19th century and early 20th century for certain. So then the Soviets, the KGB, comes up with this cool idea called liberation theology. And they take this idea and they cook up a way to reinterpret the scriptures in terms of their Soviet liberationist Marxism. And rather than trying to defeat the Catholic Church from the outside, they decide to subvert it from the inside. And so what they do is they tell they tell people that are communists, they say, if you were raised in the church, go back. Go become a priest if you can. Rise through the ranks. Become a bishop if you can. Be a cardinal if you can. Your communist duty is to now go bring this liberation theology doctrine into the church and start to poison it from within. So one could say, on the same logic, that all of the encyclicals, all of the great writs of the, one holy and apostolic Catholic Church were insufficient to prevent the infiltration of liberation theology, or they enabled it, and therefore they're worthless. Or one could go back further and say the Bible itself was insufficient. And you say, well, the Catholics, it's more of church authority, and they're not necessarily, I mean, the priests and things are reading the scriptures, but historically, the scripture was not in vernacular languages. So maybe the laity wasn't reading it as much. But then you have the social gospel, which was cooked up by the Fabian socialists with Walter Rauschenbusch, who comes into Hell's Kitchen with his Baptist congregation there in New York City and ends up spreading the same progressive garbage that, Jesus was the first socialist, being kind of a premise in both of these, through the Protestant Bible reading churches. And you have this huge thing. In fact, a lot of the great revival that you see in the early 20th century and then later in the mid 20th century that kind of gives us the very conservative Protestantism we're familiar with today are huge reactions to the social gospel movement taking over. So are we supposed to conclude that the scripture itself wasn't sufficient to prevent communism? It's like the best thing against it. Yeah. So what are you talking about?
It's interesting because if you wanted to continue to reduce that back, you could say, okay, was was God not sufficient in keeping Satan from falling or tempting Eve or whatnot, or are some of these things in God's wisdom permitted to take place for whatever His purposes might be? But that doesn't mean we eliminate God as a possibility as a result. So, so here, let me ask you this then.
Yeah.
So let's say wokeism has been defeated. Okay, but just like I'm old enough to remember when the Soviet Union was defeated, and I remember watching the Berlin Wall fall and think, well, we settled that. Turns out we didn't. These things come back. Nothing is new under the sun. These things come back. There will be some that will say, okay, fine, James. I agree with everything you just said. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a home defense weapon and it is locked up in a safe, it's not a home defense weapon. That's right, because when you really need it, you don't want to be fumbling around with a complex combination in order to get access to your firearm. But Nick, I have little ones in the house. How do I protect them at the same time? Great question. That is where StopBox Pro comes into play. Because StopBox Pro, unlike others, doesn't have complex combinations, keys, batteries, things that you have to rely on that could fail you in the moment when you need it. Instead, it's got a special push button design. You can use it very easily. One hand, get access to your firearm in order to protect your loved ones and protect your little ones who are not yet ready to handle those firearms appropriately. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to go to stopboxusa.com/MTA. That's stopboxusa.com/MTA. You're going to use that code MTA. Why? Because you're going to get 15% off your order. That's right. 15% off your order when you use code MTA. Go check out the link in the description. You're going to like them. Protect the Constitution. We're going to protect classical liberalism within the American tradition. We're going to try to get back to that. However, based on your own words, you've acknowledged that certain ideologies and belief systems, communism, Islamism, like jihadist Islam, etc., these things are antithetical to the philosophy and the worldview that you've espoused. And so therefore, next time, there's going to be certain things we don't even allow into the public space. Would you say, okay, that's reasonable? Or would you say, no, you still have to have freedom of inquiry. You still have to have freedom of speech. You still have to have freedom of thought. Or so are there any legal restrictions, or is it one of those things where it's like, no, these are just ideas that we have to defeat through better argumentation?
Well, the challenge is that it's very difficult to identify these things. They're parasitic. Like I don't know if you've ever managed to get a leech. Did you feel it? You ever had a tick? Did you feel it bite you? You don't typically notice a parasite when it latches on. So parasites develop strategies like even most people, like there are some mosquitoes when they bite you, you're like, what the heck? I felt that. But a lot of times they bite you and they're already gone before you even feel them. They have lots of sophisticated mechanisms by which they will hide themselves. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite stories, I'm not wearing it today, but I have these t-shirts that say anti-communist on them in a variety of different styles. I wear them all the time. I wear them in public. I don't care what state I'm in. I don't particularly care what country I'm in. I probably wouldn't do it in China. But you get me, right?
Yeah.
So I wear these shirts all over the place, and people compliment me on these shirts all over the place. And the funny thing is sometimes people would I refer to them as visible Democrats with the colorful hair. We'll just be very polite in our description. A fair amount of extra body mass, not very sharp clothing, and a mask on a lot of times will come up to me and tell me, I mean, I'm thinking of this one older lady, as a matter of fact, that I'm describing here, rainbow hair, pretty fat, wearing sloppy clothes, mask on her face, sees my shirt. Oh, I love your shirt. And I'm thinking, you do? Like, do you know it's about you?
What do you get that?
And I just kind of probed a little, had a little conversation with her, and she had no idea. I mean, I didn't put her on the spot. I just probed to see. She had, oh, I don't like communism. Communism's really bad. Those people, it ends up causing all this starvation. She has no idea that she's fallen into this communist picture. So if you want to pass these laws, you're going to have this kind of set of problems that open up, these cans of worms. One of which is that you may not be able to detect the thing that you're trying to prohibit, because it's probably not going to be so stupid as to wander around with a hammer and sickle. In fact, woke didn't until quite late in the game, and people started to finally notice it. I still remember trying to convince people, not even that critical race theory is Marxist, that it's critical theory. It was like a 2-year project in 20 and 21. And it's like, all you have to do is put your finger over the word in the middle, and it's like right there. And, quotes directly from Kimberly Crenshaw, who created it, saying that it's critical theory. And then people are like, I don't know if it really is. It's different. And so, this subtlety of the parasite is a problem. So you may not even be able to detect it. And then the second can of worms is kind of corollary to that, which is that this will get weaponized. People will start, let's say you outlaw communism of whatever, Marxism or whatever. You're going to have whoever's in power trying to find convoluted arguments to name something they don't like as communism so they can ban it. So you have this real problem on your hands. And so I think that it's actually, there is a big question here, which is, what do you do with militant ideologies? This question was raised by Karl Popper in Open Society and Their Enemies, in that infamous footnote where he outlines the paradox of tolerance. And he gives an answer, but the answer is obviously not sufficient. And I think all the discussion that we're all having about these things, really the rubber meets the road as to where do we withdraw tolerance from a militant ideology. And I think we do have...
I'm sorry, let me just say one thing on that with the Karl Popper, because I think this is important. This really does, I think, get to the crux of some of the problems between the people that 5 minutes ago, I know people that 5 minutes ago were libertarians, and now are like, raise the black flag. I'm never allowing this to happen again. And their argument is, well, look, if you're going to tell me I'm not allowed to engage in, vigilantism, fine, I accept that. Well, then state power has to be used for something. What's the legitimate use of state power if it's not to protect our civilization and our society from this kind of invasion. And they might even say, look, I get it. We have to be specific because nuance can be dangerous, but they're tired of hearing oh, well, what if the shoe was on the other foot? It is, right? That's their
Yeah.
argument. They come back and I get it because I share that frustration,
Mhm.
but I also share the skepticism, right? This
Mhm.
concentration of power, and we're going to use it. Like I'll put it this way. I agree that the reason why the state wields the sword is because there is at times a very necessary and legitimate use of power in order to achieve justice and
Yeah,
stability.
me too.
But we're also trying to do that while preserving these concepts of freedom.
Mhm.
And so we do have to be careful on how we wield the sword. So are there any ways that you would look at that and say, okay, here are some of the ways that the sword should be wielded, and maybe in ways that it's not currently being wielded, or
Yep.
to an extent that here are ways that it should be wielded that would actually address those concerns, those legitimate concerns, while still preserving those aspects of the classical liberal and the American tradition, those elements of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done, and there are things that have been being done in the past that are not being done, and there are some things that like I said at the very beginning, that are technologically based, that are some real questions that actually have to be answered. We actually have to figure out how to wield power in order to secure rights and prevent invasions in the digital sphere. This is seriously a big problem and an open question. But for example, obviously the program has slipped in terms of repelling invasions. When you know that you have people of other ideologies outside of the country who are trying to come into the country, and they want to come in large numbers, and of course we're mostly thinking of Muslims here. We're not necessarily thinking of communists, but yes, communists too. We used to screen for ideology for letting people in, but this has been degraded. That can be easily restored. Um, Very limited numbers, ideally maybe zero, of people who hold and express militant ideology should be allowed in. I am very cautious around this, and of course it's constitutional, so it would require an amendment. But I do think that there is cause to look at some aspects of naturalization. It is clear that the so-called anchor baby game is somehow illegitimate. It is also clear that we naturalize people, and 5 minutes later they're out screaming, death to America, and this is somehow a problem, right? And you say, oh, well, they're an American citizen now, therefore, you can't do anything about it. And I don't think that that's actually true. I don't think that denaturalization should be an easy process by any means. It should be taken quite seriously. But if you have people joining, it's already a law that if people are joining terrorist groups or engaging in seditious or subversive activities against the country or engaging in conspiracy against the state, that these people can lose their naturalization, and they probably should get sent home. I mean, I think we should be very serious about that and looking into it. We are going to have to address either one or the other, the porousness of our border, which given airplanes is a thing, or some provision about the anchor baby, as it's called, circumstance, because this is creating a gigantic loophole in immigration law. We also are going to have to figure out how to deal with this. Like, one of the ways that we've been gamed on this by communists in particular is this stupid refugee status game.
Asylum
And
seekers
yes, asylum seekers, Muslims too. The radical mullahs know exactly what to do. They cause massive amounts of instability and war in a region that's filled with their people. Those people claim that they need to get asylum, and then they pour into Western countries in the name of asylum, even though the whole thing was an operation to get them into Western countries in the first place. These kind of things have to be understood as military operations against the United States and need to be governed as such. And I think that there is a lot that could be done in that regard. And to be honest with you, I think that the Trump administration is actually showing hopeful steps in the right direction, but it's a longer problem than we probably want. But
Can I
so
ask you
the
another
short
thing?
answer, though, is yes, I do see
Yeah.
things that we can be doing. The state has two essential functions according to the Constitution. One is to secure the rights of individuals in the United States. And the second, well, I mean, it has a few others too, but the second is to prevent invasions from other parts. And so we should, from hostile foreign enemies. So we should definitely be doing that. A lot of the woke stuff, a lot of it And some of these ancillary problems that come in with these militant ideologies can actually be addressed through rigorous and firm application of equality under the law. Because what we actually have is badly two-tiered systems that have been cooked through, I don't know, 5 to 7 decades of leftist manipulation of the legal field, all of which can be walked back. If we could have Roe v. Wade overturned, we can have a lot of things reconsidered. If we can have the Harvard case and the UNC case roll back equity and diversity in university admissions, I know they're fighting back, but this has just begun. And the Supreme Court has been on our side and is going to be on our side more. Then we can actually push back on this two-tiered justice system, this liberating tolerance justice system they've established. It's just going to take time and clarity and deliberate, consistent work to achieve it. And we have to, in my opinion, do that and start literally today.
Let me ask you a couple other questions, just like hotbed issues that have come up right now that Trump is either doing or considering doing. For instance, would you say that it would be like an appropriate use of state power to start like defunding universities which are engaging in some of this more radicalized behavior or whatnot? Do you think that would be an appropriate use for the state to not necessarily use its power aggressively as much as it is just refuse to fund these things?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think that's a mass. I mean, well, I think what Trump's been doing with Harvard is fantastic, and I think that this kind of pressure, granted, resources are a problem. This kind of pressure tactic has to be put almost on every university. The thing is, though, is that there's another thing that a lot of my black-pilled friends don't understand, which is the nature of the liability field. It seems like this insurmountable problem. They all just do whatever they're going to do. I'm telling you, you do something like a funding crush on like, or somebody ends up in jail for their terrorist supporting activities or whatever, about a dozen times. And all of a sudden, most of this stuff starts going back underground. The deterrence factor actually kicks in, and it currently has not kicked in. So it's a different liability field as we actually play the game. So we do need to be playing the game. I do support these kinds of things. Absolutely. The ideological territory we can't just stand by and watch things that are openly and actively seditious to the country
Mhm.
being the fundamental program of our universities, but we have to be in our schools. We have to also, though, be very, very clever in how we go after these things. I would love to see actually huge pathways to private action be opened up to people who can claim that they were defrauded by the university that did not provide them the education that it
I'll
sold
tell you
them.
what, and as someone that has carried legislation, not specifically in that field with education, but in other areas, the moment you do civil right to action, you will you will never meet so many lobbyists in your life on behalf of these large organizations,
That's right.
will come and try to fight against it. Let me throw out another one here because this is one that I've been struggling with. Um, the use of the National Guard for, crime areas and whatnot. And, because, posse comitatus, and we have this long tradition that we don't utilize the military in order to handle what we would call criminal activity unless it rises to the level of insurrection. And this is a very, very long and proud tradition within the United States, and one I generally and one I support. Now, when Trump nationalized the situation or federalized in DC, perfectly constitutional.
Hmm.
That is the District of Columbia. It is a federal district. Simply because they've given him some home rule components did not strip the federal authorities of being able to do that.
Right.
Now, I thought when there was first discussion of going into like Chicago, I was like, okay, this is a little bit problematic because if you're going in there simply because they have a high murder rate, I don't care what you want to call it. I don't care how much a part of me would love to see it. We're crossing a line now. Now, God bless the mayor of Chicago. The moment he set up ice-free zones, I'm like, okay, well, now what you're doing is you're engaging of obstruction of justice on
Hmm.
federal law enforcement authorities. So now if he has to send in additional reinforcements to carry that out, you've actually provided the legal ramifications for him to be able to potentially say that's insurrection because it's now a city mayor actively engaging in obstruction of justice. You can't do that.
Yeah.
That's a violation. Um, but that was one thing that I kind of struggled with was this idea of when is it appropriate because I feel very confident that Donald Trump using the National Guard or other federal resources, descending on Chicago, you could demonstrate very quickly, just as it's been demonstrated up in DC, that without stripping everyone of their liberties or stripping everyone of their civil rights, without doing any of that, simply by actually having sufficient resources and actively and aggressively prosecuting the law, it turns out cities don't have to be cesspools of crime and degeneracy. Um, but man, there was a line there that I'm like, I'm not comfortable with this.
I'm with you on the line, and I think you actually articulated the position that I have pretty well, which is, what's within the constitutional authority, and if it's him deploying reinforcements in order to uh, deal with federal law enforcement being hindered, obstructed, attacked, or whatever it happens to be, whether it's in the Los Angeles riots in June, whether it's whatever in the universe is going on in Portland, like you said, these ice-free zones in Chicago, et cetera. He's within his authority to do that, and he should. But what I see the DC case is actually instructive here, and I think that he's not doing what he should be doing with it. And not to say that the city's not safe, because I think he's doing that part right. The goal, like basically the messaging apparatus, or I don't want to call it propaganda in the charged sense, but the propaganda campaign in the neutral sense of propagating information that he's doing. This is the same problem, by the way, in the Charlie Kirk letter to Bibi Netanyahu, where he's like, where is your media game? Like, there should be a media game, like
Yeah.
nobody's business on how great and safe Washington, D.C. is. There should be a media game saying that the priority is to restructure and reorganize the DC Police Department so that it can defederalize as quickly as possible, but that we're going to prioritize security and order. And meanwhile, it's constant positive messaging about how much safer, how much more secure
Yeah.
DC is. So it becomes a marketing mechanism against these other cities that are resisting, because ultimately what you want is you want the citizens of Chicago, of Portland, good luck, Seattle and Los Angeles and so on, saying, wait a minute.
Mhm.
Our mayors have been telling us, the Democrats have been telling us there's no solution here. So Trump could be turning this into a big political opportunity by having cleaned up one of the worst cities for crime in the country, DC. But I don't like, when I open my phone, I don't see this every day or even once a week. It's like
Yeah.
I should be seeing this messaging campaign every day, which would sell a lot of Americans. A lot of people are lost in this like black pilled left versus right. It's the left versus the right, but it's like, I don't know what the percentages are, but there's a bunch of people, believe it or not, who are floating. They're not
Yeah.
floating, like they lean pretty strongly one way or the other, perhaps, but they're still floating. And there are a lot of people like you look at the changes in the vote outcomes in the 2024 election, how many people went to Trump in so many urban areas in New York City, Los Angeles, and so on. That was just, it wasn't enough to turn the county or whatever the district red, but it was shocking. And in some cases it did. These numbers, I mean, what was it? Wasn't there this map that came out and it's every county in America except one, or all of them maybe, went more to the Republicans than the previous election or some?
It's interesting. My my co-host on Making the Argument, Christian Hines, who you guys have had some interesting debates on X and whatnot. He started pointing out several years ago. He called it the donut theory, and he started pointing out that actually the inner cities are becoming far more conservative.
Yeah.
And I remember telling him, like, you're out of your mind. He goes, no, Nick. He goes, you don't see it because it's not impacting congressional races. He goes, when AOC wins her race by 75%, you don't think about it, except that she won it by 83 the year before. That's a huge shift.
Mm-hmm.
And he pointed out that every single borough in New York City had gotten significantly more Republican, except with the exception of Manhattan, which is interesting for other reasons. And he goes, people are getting sick of what's going on within their cities. And it hasn't reached a critical mass to impact, like, again, congressional races or even your town council or city council races, but gubernatorial races, presidential races, like it can have some impact there.
Yeah.
And it's been fascinating to see that it's actually not just in the United States. Javier Milei, who's one of my favorite world leaders, won his race largely because of young voters in Buenos Aires.
That's right.
I mean, that kind of flies against what we've traditionally thought of your more like conservative voters versus your more liberal voters, but it does say that something is shifting.
I think
Let
this
me,
is a huge opportunity, right? And it
yeah,
doesn't have to be a ham-fisted, government driven. It can have some elements of it. Trump is like a master of this kind of thing. Why he's not bragging on his accomplishment more, I'm not sure. But like we've got all these influencers who've decided like that their, primary thing they need to do is go run speculations about Israel or speculations about Charlie Kirk or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, why don't you just go to DC and film how cool it is now that there's not people being murdered every 5 minutes? You love to make your little propaganda reels and stick them all over Instagram. Like, why don't you go do that? Oh, wait, because you need conflict and drama to drive your clicks. But this kind of a messaging or propaganda push, in the neutral sense of the term, again, to illustrate to voters in these other cities, this donut theory is not a bad idea. Like Christian has some smart ideas, like that's not in question. He's a very smart guy. He's just, in my opinion, radicalized. But this observation's correct, and this can be strongly encouraged by looking at this particular example. Instead, we're focusing on the conflict, and I even see people kind of accelerating the conflict, like in Portland and in Chicago, because if it bleeds, it leads. But there could be this message like, look at the hellhole that Chicago is, and its stupid mayor's doing this, and it's just making the problem worse. Meanwhile, it could be like a back-to-back war zone scene of Chicago, South Chicago or whatever, and then like people just enjoying lunch at a cafe in DC. Like
Yeah.
the sun is
Oh,
shining and it's
I thought one of the most brilliant things that was done, and I was trying to wonder, okay, is this chance or is this five-dimensional chess, right? But when he was first talking about sending the National Guard into crime-ridden cities, you all of a sudden you had these Democrat governors and Democrat mayors going, why do you keep picking on blue cities and blue states? Why don't you start focusing on what about Memphis? And then all of a sudden Trump was like, great idea. And the governor of Tennessee was like, great idea. Well, once again, now you've moved something that, if you're just sending in the National Guard to clear out the crime, that's somewhat problematic constitutionally. But if you've got a governor of a state going, no, we need help down here. Well, now all of a sudden, some of those constitutional barriers that might have been a problem before go away. And like you said, it becomes a use case of, yeah, these cities don't have to be this way. You've been lied to for 6 decades, right? They don't have to
yeah.
be this way. Let me. I want to ask one other question, and that is because one of the things I wanted to establish is no, James Lindsay is not just saying vote harder or argue harder. Yes, there's legitimate ways that we can use state power within the boundaries of the Constitution, and that we can be aggressive while still preserving our values. Like that's not a contradiction. It's not a contradiction, and you've articulated some of those here with respect to immigration policy, with respect to crime and things of that nature. Again, let's say we get what we want and we have the people in place, the executive branch, and we don't just have the Senate, we actually have a filibuster proof Senate where we can actually get cloture. We have the House, we have a friendly Supreme Court. Are there any structural changes you would make to, let's say, the Constitution, or to existing amendments? Are there any things that you would make that you feel would do a good job of addressing kind of how we got here while still preserving, the principles and the values that you want to preserve?
Not at the level of the Constitution, barring the discussion about immigration points that I raised earlier. That's, of course, a place where I think there's a fruitful debate to be had about these kind of 2 or 3 loopholes in immigration law that have been the excuses by which the both Democrats and Republicans, but overwhelmingly Democrats, have exploited our country over the past 30 years. And so, other than that, no, not at that level. What I would, especially since you said we have a friendly court, what should be happening is a very strategic, very informed, clarity driven push, not to play lawfare. Although I watched Charlie Kirk's video that has come around, it floated around a bunch about playing offense, and in that the DAs and AGs and conservative states should be indicting Democrats who do illegal things, playing a game of tit for tat. I'm not opposed to a tit for tat indictment lawfare game either, actually, but that's not the question you asked. But what I do think is possible is that we have to have a strategy to look at where principles like the Equal Protection Clause have been lost, and all of that has to start getting undone. So, I mean, some of it has been attacked, right? Very successfully. Trump removed Johnson's affirmative action executive order for the first time in 60 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
That thing is a shock, right? So you have the Civil Rights Act passed in 64. No doubt, Civil Rights Act needs reform, but it's mostly squared up. But what happened was in 65, he signs this executive order that literally violates it and the Equal Protection Clause it's supposed to be based on. And then this kind of continues so that by 71 now you have in Backey versus, no, sorry, wrong one. You have Griggs versus Duke Power, a Supreme Court case decided that, oh no, the disparate impact doctrine of law is how we're going to interpret whether or not there's a discrimination suit under civil rights law. So what you have is this shift from the idea of the protected classes, meaning protected classifications. Nobody gets discriminated against based on race because Equal Protection Clause of 14th Amendment. That's Civil Rights Act in some of those titles. And it gets turned into, well, black people are not doing as well in society, therefore you can't discriminate against them. And if anything comes out to where the numbers aren't, perfectly at parity, then there was probably discrimination hiding somewhere, and we can act as though you did. This has got to go. That's communist BS. That's a straight Soviet import into our law. So what we would need to be doing is using the court heavily to find and smart people working in DC, et cetera, finding those particular court cases and getting these twisted interpretations of law out, finding where the loopholes that got exploited to get those and other things in legislation and get that out. For example, the 1991 Civil Rights Act actually codifies all this. That's got to go. If we're going to have the Civil Rights Act, it needs to be based on the Equal Protection Clause because there is no equitable protection clause. And we've got to have that kind of mentality and be very hardline about it.
You said something earlier, and it reminded me of, I had a journalist come up and ask me about a bill I had, and he said, "What's your guys' problem with the word equity?" And I said, "The way you use it." Equity means a fair and just outcome, but you interpret equity as equality of outcomes, and equality of outcomes is not equitable.
That's right.
It actually flies in the face of it. And he goes, "Well, no, it's not equality of outcomes, it's equality of opportunity." I said, "Oh, well, that's okay, that's cute. So let me ask you a question. How do I measure whether or not equality of opportunity has been achieved? If you're gonna tell me that the only way I can measure it is by the demographics of the country and then the demographics of a corporate board and say, well, if these two don't match up, equity has not been achieved, well, then what you want is equality of outcomes." And that is, again, it's completely unjust. But and it's
That's
the
a
same
Soviet
with
program. So
it
of
is,
course
yeah.
it is.
Disparate impact, all of this. So, okay. So I'm gonna do kind of a quick synopsis here, and you tell me how close I was. James Lindsay is saying that what we should be fighting for on the right is a country which once again embraces kind of the American version of the classical liberal traditions: individual liberty, private property rights, free markets, limited constitutional government, representative government, all of these things. We should appreciate and respect the idea of what John Adams said, a moral and religious people, the transcendent and objective truth, the objective morality. But we should never use that as an excuse to use state power to compel a particular religious belief. We have to use legitimate state power as it currently exists, and as the federal government can or the executive can within the current constitutional boundaries to push back against some of these bad legal decisions that have been put in place with respect to civil rights, like things like disparate impact and this kind of communist infiltration or socialist infiltration of what we might agree are good ideas within the American tradition of equality before the law, but not equality of outcome. We need to look very, very hard with respect to what we mean by naturalization. What is it? What does it mean to be an American citizen? And if someone becomes an American citizen, but then you know engages in you know openly subversive or even terrorist activities, denaturalization should be a consideration that we should use carefully, but should always be an option. Um, but ultimately, what we need to do is once again reaffirm that the founders got a whole lot right within our Declaration of Independence, within our Constitution and our system of government. And really, what this is about is once again recognizing that we need to double down on what they created, and we need to recognize that we have it doesn't protect itself. It requires human beings to believe in it, to fight for it, to insist upon it, and we can do that within a free society. But ultimately, it's on us, and that's what the right should want and should be fighting for. What would you add or take away from that?
in every generation. Like, this fight is a fight that comes in every generation. Communism has come into the world. There were actually parallel evils even in the monarchical phase before. As it turns out, secret societies like the Rosicrucians, the Bavarian Illuminati, the League of the Just, these all still existed back in the monarchy days. Monarchy couldn't totally stop secret subversive societies, and some of them caused revolutions. And I mean, look at the French Revolution, for example, with the Jacobins. So, we need to defend against this. And we need to, therefore, the piece that we haven't discussed, and it's a lot, and we don't have to get into it a lot, is education. The biggest and most important fight is still located in how we raise and educate our children, and we have to be extremely serious about this. Right now, even if they come out as conservatives, our kids are being just washed in a conflict theory based picture of society, an identity politics based vision of society. And it's no surprise that they come out completely cooked and don't know how to deal with a actual republic based on the proposition that all men are created equal, because they've had nothing but rejection of that. And there's two ways you can reject it, of course. A lot of them on the left are like, it's not working for me, so it's crap, burn it down. A lot of them on the right are like, it's completely biased, and therefore, if it's going to be biased, it's always going to be biased. There's no value neutrality, therefore it's going to be our way or the highway. And there's two ways you can step into that game. And we call them, leftism and radical rightism. And if we don't get education back under control, if we don't figure out that education should be about producing people for our society, for our economy, for our communities who can build, who can create, who can lead, who can deal with these challenges, then we're lost. The only other point I didn't touch on at all, and I'll just throw it out there, it would be a huge thing to get into, is again, we've got to think very, very seriously if we're going to take a classically liberal approach in the American sense, which is all about securing rights. We don't know what, like, the property right question I raised at the beginning is extraordinarily challenging in the digital domain. We don't actually know what digital property represents, and it is going to become more and more and more important, not less important, over time. It's easy to think of, like, can you steal a meme? That's like in copyright domain, but you have like right to fix for tractors. You've got tons of issues. And then within the digital domain, how do you prevent it? So the Constitution authorizes the federal government to repel an invasion. Well, what about wide scale people's war from the People's Republic of China or Russia or Iran or our other coordinating enemies? What about propaganda warfare coming in through social media beamed into our heads while we lay comfortably in bed thinking we're safe at home? We don't realize, something like, I think it's on X, it's something like 250 million accounts in the last 10 years come from the third world. It's a
Mhm.
gigantic percentage. So they bring all their fun third world values, and that's the people we're applying to, often pretending to be American so that you'll interact with them and they can get their Twitter bucks or whatever else it is. And so we've got this major problem where a lot of that is subversive, that it is political warfare, people's war, unrestricted war, whichever term we want to use, 5G warfare, whatever one we want to use, from gigantic military budgets in China and Russia, etc. And that's an invasion too. That is an ideological and mental invasion. It's not boats showing up on our shore or planes crossing into our airspace necessarily, or a rocket coming down from space, an ICBM or whatever. It's a different kind of penetration and invasion. And we haven't even had a real conversation about what that looks like at all, to try to deal with that kind of thing, much less to deal with, what is a digital bill of rights? Is that a constitutional thing? It might be. What does that kind of look like? So this digital space, this technology space, is also a ground state that we're floating around in all these philosophies, and we're forgetting that the technological universe that we operate in has shifted, like when the printing press was invented, but times 10 or times 100. And
Yeah.
we don't know how to reckon with that. I mean, property before the printing press was pretty straightforward. Intellectual property wasn't a thing, more or less at all, because you couldn't just easily rip off somebody's, work of intellectual quality or whatever. And then you could. and it became very easy later. But then, as you know, Metallica tried to prove for us with Napster back in like the early 2000s, now we're in this whole like, if you know, Metallica writes a song and now there's an MP3 of it, can anybody just go get that? Should Metallica get royalties? How could you authenticate that? Do we really want to enter into a world where you can authenticate that, like with blockchain or whatever else? These are hard questions that I don't know if we're actually grappling with. So I feel like this sleepwalk into Brave New World is kind of a backdrop to our problems. And I think that these are more fruitful veins of debate than, you know, whether or not we have to upend the Constitution because we don't know how to deal with kids with purple hair who've decided that they can be a cat or whatever in large numbers. So this is a much more fundamental, I think, part of the open question of what does classical liberalism look like in the 21st century, where something like digital property and mass communication on a global scale, what does it actually look like to fulfill the Constitution at that level? That's, I think, a more important conversation than a lot of these airy-fairy philosophical ones, but we've got to have the philosophical ones too, so that we can orient in the right direction to deal with those problems.
Yeah, you got to settle on what the principles are before you orient them toward new technological innovations and problems and disruptive technology, et cetera. But no, it is a very interesting question, and again, I've served on the technology or communications technology and innovation committee, and trying to deal with legislation on AI is difficult. People are like, why don't you just do this? I'm like, okay, because there's about 30,000 different ways that can go really, really wrong.
Yeah. And you
But
can't
no,
ban AI because it's math, right?
yeah,
You
yeah.
and
Well,
it's strategically unwise.
Well, James, I also want to say I couldn't agree with you more on the education front. People have asked me several times, what's the one issue was the one hill I would die on legislatively in the General Assembly, and I always told them if I could get significant education reform where we didn't live in this world of government monopolization of it, I would absolutely do it in a heartbeat. We ended up homeschooling all three of my kids, and I can look back on all the things that I wish I would have done better. I always say all my kids love Jesus and they really can't stand communism. So, you know, victory, mission accomplished, at least on that level. But, and on that education front, I would really encourage everybody to go check out new discourses. I think it's really important to understand what it is that we're actually up against. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, James, and I have had here today. I certainly have, on what we should be fighting for, but we still have a pretty formidable opponent that we're fighting against. And like I said before, I don't think anybody has done a better job of making that information and that understanding and the history of it more accessible than James has. James, can you please tell us where we can find out more about the work that you've done?
Most of the work is located at newdiscourses.com. The podcast platform is called the New Discourses Podcast. It's everywhere you listen to podcasts. And I'm on all the social medias at Conceptual James, with the exception of Facebook, which still has me banned for life. So you can't find me on Facebook, but everywhere else.
All right. Well, we'll have to call Mark after this. Not like he's going to pick up our phone for us, though. But once again, James, thank you very much for joining us. And thank all of you. Please let us know what you thought in the comments. And we look forward to seeing you next episode.